Medieval peasants weren't just growing food. They were engineering crops so resilient, nutritious, and relentless that today's superfoods look like decoration. These weren't trendy vegetables. They were survival tools, designed to endure harsh climates, poor soil, and long winters. Some of them were so efficient, so versatile, and so durable that they outperform many modern staples. They didn't exist for taste or looks. They existed to keep entire villages alive. And while we've forgotten most of them, history hasn't. Let's uncover 15 lost crops that weren't bred for likes. They were built to feed kingdoms. Long before protein bars, smoothie bowls, or anything labeled ancient grain in a $12 salad, 5 humble crops were keeping medieval Europe alive. These grains didn't just feed people, they fueled entire civilizations. They kept peasants strong, laborers moving, and in some cases, better nourished than we are today. They weren't trends, they were super grains, and somehow we forgot them. So, let's start digging. First up, emmer wheat. One of the first domesticated grains in human history, emmer became a medieval staple for good reason. It had more protein than modern wheat, was loaded with minerals like zinc and iron, and grew well in rocky, nutrient-poor soil. Peasants survived on it, nobles hoarded it. Bread made from emmer was heavy, dark, and dense enough to double as a blunt weapon. But it filled bellies, sustained workers through 12-hour days, and actually made people feel full. Some monasteries considered it so essential that they locked it away like treasure, stored next to silver and relics. When harvests failed, riots broke out, and the loss of emmer grain was often the spark. It wasn't just food, it was survival. So why did we stop eating it? Because industrialization favored convenience. Emmer had a tough husk that required more work to process, and nutrition lost to speed. Next, spelt. A close cousin of emmer, spelt was easier to handle and equally impressive. High in fiber, rich in B vitamins, and lower in gluten, it earned a place in both monastery kitchens and peasant cookpots. Peasants boiled it into porridge or baked it into thick, chewy loaves that stayed edible for days. Sometimes weeks, depending on your definition of edible. Monks swore by it for digestion. Farmers swore by it for endurance. Modern nutritionists now praise spelt for its digestibility and lower inflammation risk. But medieval cooks didn't need studies. They knew what worked, and spelt worked. Now meet the everyman's grain, barley. It grew fast, endured cold, and tolerated bad soil. And it was everywhere, in bread, beer, porridge, and even as tax. Yes, peasants paid their dues in barley. That's how vital it was. A bowl of barley stew could fuel a full day's labor. Barley bread was coarse and dark, often filled with grit from stone mills. But it was packed with fiber and minerals. No probiotics, no gut science, just results. It even beats oats in one key area, beta-glucan. This heart-healthy fiber made medieval porridge better for cholesterol than your overpriced oat milk. Barley didn't look fancy, but it delivered. Next up, buckwheat, which, despite the name, isn't wheat at all. It's a pseudo-cereal related to rhubarb, and it thrived where other crops failed. It grew fast, ignored bad soil, and crowded out weeds like a grain with attitude. Medieval farmers used buckwheat as a fallback crop when nothing else would grow. It was cheap, reliable, and surprisingly powerful, because buckwheat is a complete protein, containing all 9 essential amino acids. That's rare for a grain. Even better, it's full of antioxidants, beating out many fruits per gram. Medieval cooks turned it into pancakes, porridges, flatbreads, and even fermented it into beer. One monk described that beer as tasting like bread if bread had sinned. He wasn't wrong, but it got the job done. So why did we abandon it? Simple: yield. Buckwheat didn't produce as much per acre as wheat or corn, but bite for bite it still outperforms most grains today. And finally, millet. Millet was the cockroach of grains, drought-resistant, low maintenance, and hard to kill. It fed the poor, the sick, and anyone farming soil that didn't want to cooperate. Millet porridge was basic: water, grain, and maybe fat if you were lucky. It was bland, dense, and didn't pretend to be anything else. But it filled stomachs and kept people standing. Millet is now making a comeback in places dealing with soil exhaustion and climate change. It thrives under pressure, just like it did 1,000 years ago. Medieval farmers already knew what today's world is relearning. These grains weren't grown for image or trend. They were planted in exhausted soil, harvested by frostbitten hands, and eaten because there was no alternative. Each bite came with the memory of famine and the hope of another season. They didn't need labels to prove their value. They needed weathered fields, sharpened tools, and communities strong enough to pull them from the ground. In return, they offered strength, satiety, and just enough energy to get through another day. Modern food may come with buzzwords and claims of performance, but these crops performed under siege, from climate, from poverty, from time itself. And in that silent endurance, they fed more than stomachs. Forget kale. Long before health influencers were massaging greens into salads, medieval farmers were cultivating leaves with more nutrition, more resilience, and far fewer photo ops. These weren't microgreens for garnish. They were full-sized, iron-packed survival leaves, grown for stamina, not style. These greens weren't decorative or trendy. They were tools for getting through winter, one boiling pot at a time. And some of them make modern superfoods look like fluff. Let's start with a plant that sounds like folklore but functioned like spinach. Good King Henry. This hardy perennial wasn't planted. It was simply welcomed. It grew near homes, thrived in poor soil, and returned every year like a gift the earth refused to take back. Good King Henry was rich in vitamin C, iron, calcium, and fiber. Peasants boiled it, fried it, or stirred it into thick pottage to stretch out scarce meals. Unlike spinach, it didn't wilt when looked at. Once rooted, it was almost impossible to kill. Despite all that, it's nearly vanished from modern diets. And yet for centuries, it fed millions. Quietly, effectively, and without a single marketing campaign. Next up, sorrel. This sharp, lemon-flavored green was a favorite addition to medieval soups and sauces. Its tartness came from oxalic acid, the same compound that made it useful for cleaning pots and polishing metal. That's right. It served as both seasoning and detergent. Boiled with onions, broth, or barley, sorrel added brightness to otherwise bland dishes. It grew early in spring and lingered late into the year, bridging the gap between harvests. Then there was stinging nettle, nature's painful gift. Yes, it stings when fresh, but after boiling, the hairs soften, the pain disappears, and the nutrients remain. Packed with calcium, magnesium, and more protein per gram than most greens, nettle was a go-to survival crop. Monks used it in broths and pottage, swearing it cleansed the humors and cured everything from headaches to spiritual afflictions. But foraging it wasn't pleasant. Red fingers, itchy arms, and shouted curses were common in the kitchen. Still, peasants gathered it by the sackful every spring because it was free, abundant, and absurdly nutritious. Now let's talk about chard. Known as beet leaf or Roman beet, this leafy green was common in monastery gardens and peasant plots alike. Cooked down with garlic, vinegar, or herbs, it became a staple side dish, or the main course when meat was scarce. Chard is rich in vitamin K and potassium, nutrients essential for bone strength and muscle function. When your daily work included hauling wood, digging ditches, or grinding grain, you needed all the strength you could get, and chard delivered even in frost. Unlike more delicate greens, chard survived when the weather turned. Its broad leaves held firm in the cold, making it one of the few fresh vegetables available during winter. It wasn't exciting, but it kept your joints working and your stomach full. Finally, wild leeks, also known as ramsons. These pungent, garlic-scented greens were foraged from damp woodlands and used in everything from stews to bread. High in vitamin A and known for their decongestant properties, they were both food and folk remedy. One 12th century recipe called for boiling ramsons with barley and fat to make green gruel for the weak of chest. It wasn't elegant, but it was warming, filling, and by medieval standards medicinal. Peasants ate it not because it tasted good, but because it helped them breathe. So no, medieval greens weren't trendy or beautiful, but they were rugged, reliable, and ridiculously efficient. They grew in bad soil, shaded corners, and even between stones, and they kept people alive through frost, famine, and plague. That's more than you can say for kale, and nobody ever got stung picking kale. In the Middle Ages, survival depended on what you could pull out of the ground. Fast, filling, and frost-resistant, root vegetables weren't side dishes. They were the main course. And unlike today's glossy, uniform supermarket roots, these were rugged, knobby, and often more nutritious than the food we eat now. The reigning champion of medieval roots? The parsnip. Before the arrival of the potato, the parsnip was king, sweeter than carrots, tougher than turnips, and actually better after frost. Cold weather concentrated its sugars, making it one of the few vegetables that improved under pressure. A single parsnip delivered over 100 calories, along with fiber, potassium, and a dose of vitamin C. For peasants burning thousands of calories a day, that kind of density wasn't a luxury, it was a lifeline. They roasted them, mashed them, fried them in fat, and even used them in desserts. Some early sweets used mashed parsnip in place of sugar, thanks to its natural sweetness. It was the original candy vegetable, reliable, hearty, and grown in every corner of the field. But when potatoes arrived, parsnips slowly faded, pushed aside by higher yields and easier prep. Next came a root with cult status among food historians: skirret. It looked like a cluster of pale, stringy parsnips and tasted somewhere between sugarcane and carrot. Monks grew it in cloistered gardens, and nobles planted it near the kitchen door. Skirret could be eaten raw or cooked, sweet or savory. It was soft enough for worn-down teeth and sweet enough to work in pies. And nutritionally, it packed more fiber than potatoes and more natural sugar than carrots. Its only downfall? Harvesting. Skirret grows in tangled clusters that modern machinery hates. But in the hands of medieval farmers with knives and patience, it was a prize worth digging for. Then there was the turnip. Plain, common, and criminally underappreciated. Turnips grew fast, resisted cold, and offered food at nearly every stage of development. Peasants ate the roots, the greens, and even the tops if nothing else was left. They were boiled into stews, roasted with vinegar, or mashed with garlic for flavor. In some regions, they were fermented into an early form of kimchi to stretch them through winter. Turnips weren't glamorous, but they were consistent. And in medieval Europe, consistency was currency. And then came salsify, the so-called oyster plant. When boiled, it supposedly had a faint seafood flavor, though most agreed it was more earthy than oceanic. Still, it was creamy, filling, and grew well in heavy soil that other roots refused to touch. Salsify stored longer than most vegetables, making it a living pantry during the colder months. It was rich in fiber, iron, and potassium, and found in both peasant stews and noble feasts. Herbalists even used it for indigestion and snake bites, a root with both flavor and function. Other roots rounded out the medieval pantry. Rutabagas or swedes were cold, hardy staples eaten by both people and livestock. Horseradish added heat to bland meals and was even used as a mood lifter for melancholy minds. Later, Jerusalem artichokes joined the mix. Nutty, fibrous, and packed with inulin, a prebiotic compound. Though native to the Americas, they were quickly embraced after introduction and became a quiet favorite in medieval kitchens. Their ability to grow in poor soil made them a dependable fallback when other crops failed. But medieval farmers didn't just grow roots. They studied them, in the field, by feel, and over lifetimes of observation. They knew which roots resisted rot, which ones sweetened with frost, and which could push sideways through compacted earth. They didn't have soil tests or charts. They had generations of experience, shared knowledge, and the urgency of hunger, and that made them smarter than most of us give them credit for. They weren't grown to impress. They weren't bred for sweetness, shape, or shelf appeal. They were grown to survive, to push through frost, famine, and failure without complaint. Twisted, muddy, and overlooked, they asked for nothing and gave everything. Not beauty, not luxury, just sustenance, dense, dependable, and quietly heroic. And in their stubbornness, they fed empires. Today, we chase picture-perfect produce with glossy skins and curated shelf lives. But the roots that once saved millions didn't care how they looked, only that they endured. And maybe, in a world craving resilience, we could stand to dig them. Meat was rare. Chickens were kept for eggs. Cows were milk machines. And pigs? Those were winter insurance, if you even had one. So where did medieval people get their protein? From plants. More specifically, from beans, seeds, and overlooked crops that delivered enough energy to plow frozen fields and build cathedrals brick by brick. These weren't side dishes. They were the backbone of survival. Let's start with the undisputed king. Fava beans. Also known as broad beans, they were everywhere. In monastery gardens, peasant fields, and even medieval latrines. Why? Because everyone ate them, from the nobility to the monks. Fava beans delivered up to 26% protein when dried, and they thrived in cold, unforgiving soil. But their real value was underground. Their roots fixed nitrogen, enriching the soil for future crops. Medieval farmers didn't know the science, but they knew the results. Farming guides from the 1200s advised rotating grain fields with bean plots. Not for trendiness or variety, but because it worked. It fed both people and the land they depended on. Fava beans were incredibly versatile in the kitchen. Young pods were eaten raw. Dried beans were boiled into stews. Mashed beans were shaped into fried patties, the earliest form of the veggie burger. And during Lent, when meat was forbidden, fava beans became the closest thing to hope. They didn't taste great, but they kept you upright. Sometimes that was more than enough. Next came flax, a medieval multi-tool. Today it's a superfood sprinkled on smoothies. Back then it was linen for your clothes, oil for your lamp, and calories for your survival. Flax seeds were crushed into flour, stirred into porridges, or pressed for nutrient-rich oil. That oil was used in cooking, as salve, and as a fasting food in monasteries. During hard times, some peasants mixed flax meal with ash-thickened water to bake emergency flatbreads. It wasn't elegant, but it worked. And sometimes that's all a food had to do. Then came field peas, small, hardy, and brutally efficient. They grew fast, dried well, and boiled into thick mash that stuck to your ribs. One of the first domesticated grains in human history, emmer became a medieval staple for good reason. Peasants rolled them into travel balls called pea stones, or tossed them into every boiling pot they had. They weren't flavorful, but they were filling. They stored for months and turned even weak broth into something worth eating. And for millions of peasants, they did the job every single day. Next up, hemp seed. Long before it filled modern health stores, hemp was a staple in medieval Europe. Its fibers made rope and sails. Its seeds made food. Hemp seeds are high in complete protein, with all 9 essential amino acids, and loaded with healthy fats and micronutrients. People roasted them, mashed them, or boiled them into gruel. During fasting periods, hemp oil became a crucial plant-based fat. And best of all, hemp thrived where little else could. It grew fast, needed almost no care, and came back stronger every year. If survival had a mascot, hemp would have been it. Need more examples? Lentils grew in drier southern regions and were cooked like peas or blended with grains. Chickpeas appeared in Islamic and southern European diets, ground into pastes or stews. And poppy seeds, yes, the same kind you scrape off modern buns, were used in breads, cakes, and for oil. They weren't tracking nutrition. They weren't balancing proteins, carbs, or fats. They were simply trying to stretch every harvest far enough to reach the next one. With no refrigeration, no modern fertilizers, and no backup plans, they built a diet that was dense, durable, and surprisingly forward-thinking. These weren't luxury ingredients. They were necessities grown by instinct, sharpened by hunger, and passed down through centuries of survival. And while modern diets boast superfoods, macros, and functional nutrition, medieval peasants did it all without knowing the words. They didn't aim for optimization, they aimed to stay alive. And somehow, in the harshest conditions, these plants didn't just help them survive, they helped them. So here's the question. If medieval crops were so effective, so nutritious, and so resilient, why did we stop eating them? Because clearly these plants weren't just surviving, they were thriving. They fed kingdoms, they regenerated soil, they fueled laborers who built cathedrals stone by stone, day after day, with little more than soup and boiled grain. They worked, and yet almost all of them disappeared from our plates. The short answer? Efficiency won, nutrition lost. Industrial agriculture doesn't like complicated. It favors crops that grow uniformly, harvest easily, and ship without complaint. Crops like emmer and spelt were cast aside because their tough husks made them harder to process. Skirret grew in tangled clusters that confused machines. Fava beans, despite their protein content, posed medical concerns for a small percentage of people. Concerns that weren't understood in the Middle Ages, but matter now in courtrooms and marketing departments. So when machines replaced hands, priorities changed. Farmers needed crops that looked clean, matured on schedule, and could survive the logistics of modern commerce. Not what grew best in poor soil, but what fit best in a supply chain. That meant wheat that threshed easily, vegetables that looked smooth and photogenic, fields planted with a single synchronized crop, monoculture over biodiversity. We traded resilience for uniformity, and in return we got food that looks good in a supermarket, but doesn't necessarily nourish us better. Visually appealing, nutritionally downgraded, flavor played a role too. Barley was rich in fiber and great for porridge, but it was earthy and dense, not exactly photogenic. The same goes for turnips, sorrel, and bitter greens that didn't try to hide their origins. When salt, sugar, and crunch became cheap and addictive, no one wanted a bowl of mashed root anymore. Processed foods seduced the palate, and the roots were left behind. Fast won, deep flavor lost. There was also the stigma. For generations, these crops were tied to poverty, hardship, and survival. You ate nettles because cabbage froze. You boiled lentils because meat was for the wealthy. So when people could afford white flour, they didn't just upgrade, they distanced themselves. Wheat became status, refined meant modern, and anything coarse, brown, or whole was dismissed as backward. By the time we realized what we'd lost, these crops were already gone. From fields, from recipes, and from collective memory. And in their place? Convenience foods with longer shelf lives and shorter ingredient lists. Nutritional heritage paved over by progress. Marketing didn't help. Let's face it, good King Henry doesn't sell smoothie bowls. Buckwheat sounds like cowboy feed. Fava beans are forever linked to horror films. These plants never got a fair shot in the era of kale, goji berries, and Instagrammable salads. Even though, ounce for ounce, they outclass most of what's trending today. They simply never had a rebrand. These crops weren't forgotten because they failed us. They were forgotten because they didn't fit into a faster, flashier, more fragile system. We didn't grow past them. We paved over them. But they're still here. In seed banks, in wild corners of farmland, and in the hands of people who remember what food used to mean. Not status, not spectacle, but survival, nourishment, and resilience. And as we face the pressures of climate change, soil collapse, and fragile supply chains, maybe it's time to stop searching for the next food trend. Maybe it's time to listen to the crops that fed us for 1,000 years and grow them. They didn't promise flavor, variety, or beauty. They promised calories, consistency, and a chance at tomorrow. They built the bones of Europe, not through abundance, but through resilience. They grew in frost, in famine, in fields where no market crop would dare to sprout. And for centuries, they carried entire generations forward, one bitter meal at a time. We may have left them behind in favor of glossy produce and efficient yields, but the land still remembers what actually works. And maybe deep down we do too. Because in a world that feels more fragile with every season, the question isn't which food trends are next. It's which crops can hold the line when everything else breaks. And these ones already proved they could. If this video made you want to trade your avocado toast for a bowl of hot barley and fava beans, you're not alone. Subscribe for more forgotten brilliance, medieval hacks, and food that punches harder than it looks. And tell us in the comments, which of these ancient crops deserves a comeback, and which one should stay buried?